My legends, in today's video tutorial we will be looking at how you paint Ferrus Manus' legendary wrench. It looks a bit like a thunder hammer. Gold, non-metallic gold. It is one of those recipes, it's one of those practices that people chase after relentlessly. Before we get into the how-to, it is worth looking at what gold is structurally, anatomically, and why it is such a precious metal. What makes gold even more fascinating is how it interacts with the environment around it. It can adopt the colours and characteristics of the objects around it. This phenomenon is known as environmental reflection. Gold absorbs the colours of its surroundings, making it appear to change in hue depending on the lighting conditions. So we can say silver, as light hits it, reflects. If it's been brought up to a mirror polish, you will see surrounding objects, trees, nights, people, what have you. The duller the surface, the more of a greyish sheen it will have. Gold absorbs a little bit of the light and then reflects it. Silver is reflective, whereas gold absorbs and reflects. Silver reflects, whereas gold absorbs and reflects. All right, enough theory, let's get into the practice of this. So to begin with, we've built up quite a consistent layer through our pre-coating exercise, our underpainting exercise. And like everything else on this sculpt, once we've applied that underpainting, we want to exploit the chaos. So I'm using a little bit of red leather to build up my first warm base coat. Then I'm using pale gold yellow from the MIG range. And it does feel a little bit rude not using a colour named like that with a non-metallic exercise. So my initial exploration is simply plotting light and shadow. I'm doing this with a big brush and it's all done with a layer consistency. Next up, I do want to start firming up these reflections a little bit more aggressively. So I'll add a little bit of my red leather and pale gold yellow together. And then I'll start building up my first highlights. From here, I'll be adding increasingly higher value colors to build the structure. I'm not so worried at this point about the coloration. The color I can change later on. I'm worried about the structure of light and shadow. I can mark down very simply my lights and shadows using a lighter value color. I believe I've used pale gold metal with a pinch of ivory at this stage, or any kind of white will do absolutely fine. I'm simply building my reflections along where my primary light source hits it. At all points during this painting exercise, I have considered where my two light sources sit. I have one, the magenta, and the primary one's coming from above with a slight green hint to it, and the one below with my magenta is reflecting underneath. And any light and shadow buildup will be in accordance with that. Now this is a very highly detailed sculpt, so even if you have to take a little bit of time considering your light sources, considering the build-up of light and shadow, please take that time. You'll only be painting this miniature once, maybe twice if you strip it and decide to start again. But this is a once-in-a-lifetime rare opportunity for you to paint something of this caliber. Make the most of it. Don't forget the reflection. In this case, I've used a little bit of Indian shadow, but ultimately I decided against this because I found it was a little bit too... It didn't have the saturation I was looking for. So instead, I used magenta from the Chimera range to block in my secondary shadows. So that shadow, the light source coming from below, that phosphex wreathed hell that we've been talking about, that we're locating this miniature on. Okay, I'm really relying on my wet palette at this stage. All the colours that I've built up during the entirety of the process are still available on my wet palette. I'll be exploiting it as much as possible. Right now, it is a case of just moving in between values, or moving between the values, rather than setting colour in stone. I can use glazes later in my painting process to create more warmth or more depth in the shadows, or shift colours. But for right now, it is a case of carrying along a rather linear path to build up my light and shadow. And we do need to consider what the source of this hammer is. This is a creation of Fulgrim, where the brothers exchanged gifts. Ferrus Manus gifted Fulgrim with a beautiful sword, a beautiful golden sword. And in reply, Ferrus Manus received Forgebreaker. So this is an element, or rather this is a hammer that's been forged by Fulgrim with his sense of ostentatiousness and the gold gilding. If it feels a little bit out of context for this character to wield this hammer, great. The colours are a little bit different from the muted the muted silvers and the muted greens that we've used thus far. It stands out of context with the rest of the piece. So not only are we trying to tell the story in terms of light and shadow on the location, but it's also a deeper story that we're trying to relate here through our choice of colour. Glazing, so we add a little bit of Chimera orange as a glaze consistency. This is 1 portion paint to around 3 portions thinner, and it's important to consider with Chimera we do still need to use the satin. So this is some of the satin medium the set comes with. If we don't use that, the paint does run the risk of turning slightly chalky. I overlay this from my lower mid-tone to my highlights. This is a very thin glaze consistency of paint aimed to warm up that gold. Later on in the painting process, I can increase the value again using cool colours on top, but for right now I'm trying to change the hue, I'm trying to change the consistency of the paint. I'm trying to warm things up. Okay, a little bit of phthalo green, again from Chimera, but anything like, oh no, what do we have? Forest green from, or boreal green from Scale 75. It's a green that leans on the blue side of the spectrum. Any kind of Dark Angels green would be perfect here. Again, glaze consistency, 1 portion paint around 3 to 4 portions thinner. And I use airbrush thinner for this. Any kind of acrylic thinner would be great. You reduce the consistency of the paint to create a more watery-like appearance, but you keep the intensity of the colour. If we were simply using white, we do lose a little bit of the strength and the potency of the paint. By adding a little bit of both satin medium and acrylic thinner, it ensures that we keep the strength. And we know Ferrus Manus is all about strength. X gonna give it to you. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. I got that head when I was reviewing the footage. That's what I had in my head. X gonna give it to you. X gonna give it to you. But something really hypnotic about edge highlighting and fine detail work like this. I caught myself, I don't know whether I should admit this out loud, but just kind of admiring the brushstroke. A student did ask, you should do ASMR videos, no narrative, no overlay of just painting, just brushstrokes. Not a bad idea. I know a couple of artists who do that on YouTube. They don't put any kind of instruction, it's just the tutorial out there for all to see. But we're coming to the edge highlights. So we take in pale gold yellow. Yep, pale gold yellow with a little bit of ivory added to it to re-establish those top notes of our highlight. Within the center of the X, I am using phthalo blue-green. Again, glaze consistency run in there to give a little bit of tonal variation to the piece. I wanted the X to stand out. Then very carefully, using the thinnest brush that you have, I highlight the inside of the X. I do realize I am showing off here, but you only have to do it once. Okay, so we have light, shadow established. Secondly, we've played with the hues. Great. Now it's time to give our specular reflections. Metallics really benefit from that top pinprick of almost pure white. We don't want to use pure white because that is a rather boring way to end the highlight, and there's nowhere really to go from there. We need to think of color temperature as well. What is the surrounding color temperature of the piece? Overall, it's cold. Green from above, magenta from below, both cold colors. So our top highlights on the top of the gold has the most minute amount of green added to it to make sure it is cool. So it's not pure white. No. It not only plays with value from light to dark, it also plays with the warm to cool spectrum. And that's what we're adding as specular highlights. These pinpricks of almost pure white dotted around to give the impression that you can see pinpricks of light being reflected off the hammer. The chest and all other gold areas were painted in a very similar manner. We base coat them exactly the same way. We build them up exactly the same way using the same coloration. We build structure first, glaze, and then we re-establish light and shadows. If you are attempting this miniature, please feel free to use my miniature as a guide for your own. Or if you want to substitute these for gold paints, for metallic paints rather, well, we can simply use a change in warm golds and cool golds. Cool golds at the very top, warm golds through the mid-tone to the highlight. The famous forge breaker, wrench of Ferrus Manus. Thank you so much for watching. In the next video, we'll be rounding out the Ferrus Manus tutorials. We will be finishing on a high with faces and bases. So it's interesting to see how you can take underpainting as a technique and then build realistic flesh tones on top of it. And everyone loves a good phosphex soaked base. After this series, we'll be delving into Halloween. We'll be looking at Conrad curves, and we'll be exploring underpainting again as a technique. And we'll also be bringing you the W. Artel Ripper special. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you in the next vid. And there should be a pretty big announcement coming up soon. So keep your eyes and your ears and your fingers and your brushes peeled for that.